Vani Mehta, and I'm with Carnegie India. Carnegie India is a think tank based in New Delhi and is part of a global network that includes over 150 scholars. The India Center focuses primarily on three research areas: technology and society, political economy, and security studies. Thank you so much for joining us this evening for today's event. I'm very pleased to introduce Mr. Vijay Gokhale, former Foreign Secretary of India and non-resident senior fellow at Carnegie India. Mr. Gokhale is the author of 4 seminal books, amongst which is The Long Game, How the Chinese Negotiate with India, which has recently received the Ramnath Goenka Award for Excellence in Journalism in the non-fiction book category. I'd now like to invite Mr. Gokhale to tell us about his latest book, Crosswinds, Nehru, Zhou, and the Anglo-American Competition over China.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and I really want to thank Carnegie India and the Bengaluru International Center for organizing the event today. For the release of my book, but much more interesting than that is the discussion which the 4 of us are going to have with Dr. Srinath Raghavan. Just a couple of words about why I wrote all my books. I did feel during my 40 years in the diplomatic service that a lot of people wanted to know about China, but really didn't have any information on China from an Indian perspective. There are excellent books written in the West, particularly the United States, extremely well researched, but they are from the American perspective or from a Western perspective, and almost none from an Indian perspective. So that is why I started writing. And in all the 4 books, I've tried as far as possible to write in a way in which it is not academically written. It's something that anybody can pick up and read if they're interested in China. And that is the way I really wrote all my 4 books. 2 of them specifically on China, one on how the Chinese negotiate with India, and the latest is a bit of a historic contemporary history book, which is how India made foreign policy in the 1950s, of course with China, but also with the United States of America. So very briefly, this book is based on archives in 3 different countries: the US State Department archives, as also archives from a number of private archives, the Woodrow Wilson Center, the Hoover Institution, and so on, the British archives, and they are quite phenomenal archives, many of them digitized and really well kept, and then the National Archives in India and the archives in what was known as the Nehru Memorial Museum and Library, now the Prime Minister's Memorial Museum and Library. Easily the most disorganized of the archives are the ones in India. But it is based on archival material, and essentially it's a recounting of how the governments of the 4 countries, India, China, the United States, and the United Kingdom, interacted with each other, and how outsized personalities of that period, because you did have very great personalities, Presidents Truman and Eisenhower, and John Foster Dulles, who was the American Secretary of State, Prime Ministers like Churchill, Eden, and Macmillan, of course Zhou Enlai and Jawaharlal Nehru, how they interacted, and how policy was made. I hope that it contributes to some relook at the way Indian foreign policy was made in the 1950s, because at least when I did my research, I felt there were 2 or 3 points which deserve greater study. Firstly, we all seem to think that Indian foreign policy was entirely shaped on the basis of what we call non-alignment, that is, negotiating between the Soviet bloc of countries and the American-led so-called free world. But in fact, I found in this book that while that does have some influence on foreign policy, at least with respect to China, it was not the rivalry so much between the United States and the Soviet Union as between the United States and Britain, which fundamentally influenced our China policy. The US really wanted to anchor themselves in the Pacific and fight communism, But the British were more interested in protecting their colonial possessions and their trading rights in China. And the tension between these two principal Western powers pulled India in different directions and shaped our policy. So we really need to revisit whether all of Indian foreign policy was only shaped by the Cold War. I think the second point is, what is non-alignment? We need to look at it, because at least on the basis of what I wrote in this book, on the basis of archival material, we were extremely aligned to the British in a manner which influenced our foreign relations, not just with China, but with the United States of America as well. And so my own sense on what actually, how non-aligned were we in this period? And were we not, at least on some of the issues, quite aligned during this period? The last point, which I again bring out in my final chapter, is that there was a personality-driven process, and it wasn't driven by systems. Now, that's understandable in the first history book, but it is relevant because although many things have changed in the Indo-Pacific, one problem is constant, and that's the problem of Taiwan. That was what was the dividing, the main bone of contention between the United States and China in the 1950s, and it is today returning back as the central contention in the Sino-US geopolitical relationship, because for both it is an existential problem. For China, they cannot tolerate that a country which is aspiring to be the world leader has a small island of its coast which it cannot control, and they believe the US is responsible for that. And the US, because if Taiwan falls to the Chinese, then a fellow democracy is extinguished and America has no moral authority to be the leader of the free world. So this is an issue which is both historical and contemporary. And India has very big stakes in that region in the Taiwan Strait. So I hope the book at least encourages us to think along these lines. Thank you very much again to all of you for giving me the opportunity to talk about my book, and I hope that you enjoyed. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Gokhale. I must mention that me and some colleagues at Carnegie India had the privilege of working with Mr. Gokhale and spending time at the archive. It was such an educational opportunity for all of us, so thank you. We now move to the panel discussion, Geopolitics Today, the State of the World. Mr. Gokhale will be joined by Mr. P.S. Raghavan, Chairman of India's National Security Advisory Board, Ms. Gayatri Kumar, a career diplomat having served Indian missions in Paris, Kathmandu, Lisbon, and Geneva. Mr. T.S. Tirumurthy, former permanent representative to the United Nations and presently distinguished professor at IIT Madras. Our moderator for the evening, Mr. Srinath Raghavan, is non-resident senior fellow at Carnegie India. Srinath.
Good evening, everyone. Am I audible at the back? Yeah. Am I audible?
Would you like to try that?
Is this any better?
I was trying to activate this. It seems to be here. So would you like to try this now? This seems
Check.
to be looking different. Mrs. Srinath,
Yeah. Okay.
try the lights on.
Can you please give it on?
That's what it takes, but... Yeah, I think this is working. Okay, great. I don't need to be at the top of my voice for 90 minutes. Good evening, everyone. Thanks for being here to sort of celebrate this book, which Vijay Gokhale has written, which he has already spoken about. Maybe I could just begin by asking you a little bit about, what do you think is the sort of contemporary relevance of the period that you have studied, right? I mean, as you rightly said, even though this is a work of history and you've consulted all these archives, all history is contemporary history. I mean, every piece of history which is written even about the very remote past is shaped by current concerns. And I'm just trying to understand what were the sort of current concerns that you think a book like this forces our attention on. I mean, for instance, for me as a reader, it was interesting that we never really think about India's role in the Taiwan crisis and so on, right? Our imagination of China is more along the borders which were disputed. But clearly you show that right from the very outset, we had a presence in what today we call Indo-Pacific, what is called Asia-Pacific back in the day. But I'm just wondering from your perspective as the person who wrote the book, what do you think is the sort of, the contemporary sort of relevance of a book like this? What kind of issues do you think it forces us to focus on when we think about the geopolitics of the world today?
Which one? Yeah. Seems to be busy.
Thank you, Srinath. I think we are living in and India is fortunate to be living in a very interesting era, and that is the return of the Indo-Pacific as the economic center of activity in the world. And I think this has a great opportunity for us as Indians. But we are also going to face a number of challenges because essentially the American-dominated order in the Indo-Pacific, which was established after the Second World War, is gradually fragmenting. And I think the election of President Trump might actually lead to an even faster fragmentation if he wins in November. So the challenge really is how we, India and other like-minded countries can build an Indo-Pacific order which ensures that all of us, our interests are protected, the welfare of our citizens is maintained, that there is no one overwhelmingly dominant power in the region, and that broadly peace and stability prevails. Because today there is no rules-based order in the Indo-Pacific. There is no such thing as a structure as there is in Europe. But I think that there are significant challenges. Of course, the biggest challenge to our mind is Taiwan. And I've done a separate paper, I won't take very much time, as to why Taiwan is important for us, because we tend to think it's 5,000 kilometers away and it really won't affect us, but it will fundamentally affect the way the Indian economy. Firstly, because most of our shipping passes through the Malacca Strait, 50% of Indian shipping, which means exports. A lot of our supply chains come from Japan, Korea, and China, which will be affected if the Taiwan Strait is closed or there is some sort of a crisis there. 15 of the major submarine cables that go from India to Silicon Valley are anchored off Taiwan, which means if the cables are damaged or cut, your IT-enabled services have a problem. And most of our semiconductor imports come from these countries, which means that you have massive job losses because e-logistics, e-commerce, distance education, entertainment platforms, even ordering a pizza will be impacted. So the argument I make in that paper is that while the sovereignty issue is not in dispute because India has clearly said Taiwan is a part of the People's Republic of China, the disturbance of peace and stability in the Taiwan Straits is very much India's business. And the book shows that it was our business in the 50s. Prime Minister Nehru very clearly distinguished between sovereignty and security, and that is even more relevant today. I think that's the biggest crisis, but there are other smaller ones which could also occur, both because the Gulf is relatively unstable. Of course, you have India and Pakistan, and you have North and South Korea, but none of them has such a serious implication for the rest of the world as Taiwan does.
Sure. And looking back at the sort of 1950s and today, I mean, it seems like there was a certain kind of stability to the pattern of geopolitics in Asia-Pacific at that point of time. The People's Republic of China was very much part of a communist bloc. The United States is the leader of the free world, as they used to call it. In a sense, the lines were reasonably clearly drawn across various things. But as you just referred, today, even something like the state of US domestic politics seems to put a lot of things in question. So how do you see the order today? Is it much more complicated or does it have the same clarity that it had in the 50s?
No, the order in the Indo-Pacific is still quite complicated, but I think in the 1950s we perhaps labored under the misperception that we could partner with China to shape the Indo-Pacific. I think there's a much more realistic understanding today that China is unlikely to be a partner in that sense. Of course, it is a country we cannot ignore. It's an important relationship, but it's not going to be a partner. And I think because we looked at China as a partner, we tended to look at the United States as a problem, which is not the case today either, because our relations with the United States have grown. Of course, the British Empire has faded away, but there are other important players in the region which we did not even consider in the 1950s: Japan, Australia, Indonesia, and if you go westwards, Saudi Arabia and Iran. So I think there are some things which are the same, but a lot of things which have changed, and therefore a lot of work that needs to be done by Indian diplomacy.
Sure. Mrs. Kumar, if I can bring you in on just this point that Vijay Gokhale was saying, which is that Britain in some ways is no longer the imperial power that it was in the 1950s, and that we simply do not have great power presence of the kind that Britain offered back in the day. But it still seems that there are other kinds of geometries of alliance like Australia, UK, US partnership, which is also quite active, has been reactivated precisely in order to give more teeth to the various sets of overlapping alliances that the United States has, whether it's bilateral, trilateral, quad, etc. So I'm just wondering, do you see the UK as simply a residual player who's been bought in by the United States to keep the sort of show afloat, or do you think there is a strategic role that Britain can play in the context today?
Well, thank you so much. I think you said it. This is a region where there has been a US tilt. There has been a conscious policy in the European Union as well as the UK. But keep in mind that European Union and the UK have both said in their documents, in their strategy documents, that they are aligned with the US, that the transatlantic relationship is the most important geopolitical relationship for them. So you have the integrated review of 2021 of the UK, where they talk about the Indo-Pacific tilt. There's a big, long chapter on the work that they'd like to do with India over here. And then, of course, there's a integrated review refresh, which again reiterates, but Ukraine and that has come in a big way, and working with and reinforcing the Indo-Pacific interest. Now, important thing is, if you look at the trade of all these, the European Union and the UK and the US, ASEAN and China, and also for India, ASEAN and China are our biggest partners. UK and US have come lower down the line. So for everybody, there is a reason for the Indo-Pacific to be of strategic importance in geoeconomics. But India, of course, has to balance in a kind of a strategic neutrality. The UK now has a role in the form of this trilateral partnership of AUKUS, because there was a danger of the UK being left out. AUKUS, which was of course a big surprise in 2021, it was negotiated very, very secretly. But that gives a deterrent and a defense capability to Australia, which is a very close partner and considered almost like family for the UK. So for the UK to have the Australia and New Zealand contributing and AUKUS there, it's a kind of, the Chinese have criticized it as a Indo-Pacific NATO. And so there is definitely for the UK a very strategic importance of being in that region, which has been reiterated many times.
Sure. You mentioned Australia, and it's interesting because even if you go back to the 1960s, during the Vietnam War, the United Kingdom was not participating alongside the Americans, whereas Australians actually contributed troops to Vietnam. So I think Australia sees that it has a much greater interest in making sure that the Southeast Asian barrier is not penetrated by any hostile power. But it's interesting that the United Kingdom, which has been out of the play, especially in that side of Asia Pacific, should be coming back. I also sort of just along these same lines wanted to ask you a little bit about France, which of course has more of a presence along the eastern side of the Indian Ocean and so on. But, and again, we have, which is to say, India has been doing a lot of things with France around island territories and so on. How important do you think that aspect of it is in the larger scheme of Indo-Pacific relations?
Very important to France, because I think almost 70% of their francophone colonies and are in that region. And they were amongst the first to take their ships, I think UK also, but definitely France, take their ships through the Taiwan Straits to make a point that this area has to be free, open, inclusive, resilient, and all those things. So in the European Union, I remember this was one of the priorities, and this was a point of focus that among the European Union member states, it was France that went out first with its ships into that region. So for them, it's very important to have access and sort of be part of that whole effort to keep the seas peaceful and open.
Right. So, Mr. Raghavan, I was thinking if you want to think about,
Is it working?
geopolitics at a very macro level today, it seems that you have two somewhat different theaters in which much of great power politics is playing out. One, as we've discussed, is in this wide stretch of the Indo-Pacific, all the way from east coast of Africa right through to China and Japan, which you could think of as the sort of maritime dimension of global geopolitics today. But there is also, this is the area, as Vijay Gokhale told us, is economically the most dynamic, perhaps a cockpit of various kinds of rising power rivalries and so on. But we also have a continental sort of a dimension which stretches across Europe and Asia, the old Eurasian kind of landmass that we may think of, which at some point, at the end of the Cold War seemed like had become much more quiescent, and that we were going to be thinking about rivalries in other domains and so on. But clearly, with the sort of Russia-Ukraine conflict, the very heavy involvement, at least in a supportive role of the United States and other European countries, has meant that there is a return of great power rivalry within the context of Europe itself. And perhaps that also has implications for Russia-China relations, which I'd want to ask you as well a little bit more. But maybe we could just begin with some reflections that you have on where you think the state of that particular conflict is and what it portends for any future great power relations in that domain.
Thank you. I think my first comment is that you cannot separate the Indo-Pacific theater from what is going on in Europe and in the continental domain. It's part of the same problem that we have in the world today. The fundamental problem really is that a world order has broken down. You do not have a world order today. There was the Cold War, during which there's some form of equilibrium was maintained. Once the Cold War ended, the world has not got around to adjusting to the changes in the situation around to create a new equilibrium, an order in which countries can live in some kind of a modus vivendi, even if not a harmonious modus vivendi. And what happened in Ukraine, what is happening in Gaza for that matter, all of these are a failure to adjust to a new world reality of a number of countries with a number of interests and an ability to pursue their interests. So if you come back to the Russia-Ukraine war, what is happening today is a very difficult question to answer. If you're looking at the news flow, you're hearing that assistance to Ukraine is waning in terms of solid military assistance as opposed to rhetorical assistance. Russia seems to have consolidated its position somewhere all along that front line. Ukraine is probably short of ammunition, short of manpower. But all of this does not mean that the war is coming to an end, nor does it mean that you're reaching a resolution of that situation. Because we need to understand that what happened in Ukraine did not start on February 24, 2022. It didn't even start in 2014 with the Russian annexation of Crimea. You need to go at least as far back as 2008 and perhaps even further than that. You are looking at actually a geopolitical competition for strategic space in Europe. And when you're looking at this geopolitical competition, we need to recognize as well that, you're talking today, it's not Russia, Ukraine, it is actually the United States and its NATO allies in Europe who are pitched against Ukraine. Both of them have, against Russia, yeah. And both sides have taken inflexible positions from which they cannot withdraw without great loss of face. So, what is it about? The Americans have made it very clear, and they've made it very clear through various administrations, starting from the second Clinton administration onwards, that their objective, long-term objective, is to cut Russia down to size, to make sure that Russia will never again rise to challenge the United States and its allies as a world power. Now, this has been pursued through various, there has been waxing and waning of this. The Ukraine war is actually an indication of this, an opportunity that arose. And you can see today that the Americans are pressing the Russians in the Caucasus, in the Caspian. They tried to do it in West Asia, but then there were other forces that prevented it. And then you have Europe. And one needs to understand, and here is where, Vijay's book talks about our lack of understanding of the big picture. And I think many in India do not understand the big picture of what is going on there. You look at Europe. Recently you had this Weimar Triangle, that France, Germany, and Poland, the leaders met, ostensibly to shore up their support for Ukraine. But, here are 3 European countries with different historical experiences in Europe, vis-a-vis Russia, vis-a-vis the US. They have different aspirations and ambitions in a post-Cold War world where they see more opportunities. And therefore, what they're looking for in this war, for all the rhetoric about supporting Ukraine to the end and, Ukraine shall win, Russia shall not win, they all have ideas about how they want to see a post-Ukraine war scenario. And this will also become evident. Therefore, it's not so easy today to predict what happens here. And let's face it, I think Gayatri mentioned this. Actually, when you saw the refresh, the British refresh, the British position changed towards the Indo-Pacific. They said they need to focus more on Russia. Germany has a very different position. France has a very different position for all of what Macron says. So you're really talking about a unified disorientation, let us say. Something that, so you need to solve it as a whole, and you need to find a modus vivendi, and as long as you have zero-sum game approaches, whether it is in Europe or it is in the Indo-Pacific, I don't think you're going to be able to find any kind of a world order. I mean, it's a very long answer to a short question, but even that is not complete, I must say.
Right. So if I can ask a shorter follow-up, so what's the most likely sort of end game? It is just going to be some kind of a ceasefire which is continuously broken and violated, and this just becomes a situation that is going to persist, just as it persisted from 2014 onwards, which means that there is some low-intensity conflict along the Ukraine-Russia frontier, wherever that frontier settles.
See, 2014 is very different from 2024. Firstly, now that you know on the basis of documents available, and even on the basis of what President Obama has said publicly.
And Angela Merkel as well, I think.
No, Angela Merkel actually contradicted herself. I'll come back to Angela Merkel. Angela Merkel and the French Prime Minister, that Hollande, they both either told lies then or they're telling lies now. So, you have to decide when they told the lies. But coming back to what President Obama did, very clearly he said that, look, we understood at that time that Crimea was ethnically Russian, there was a Russian claim, and therefore we did not push it so much. What happened now, to talk about Merkel and Hollande, Russia took advantage of that to encourage these guys to take over the Donbass, and they made such great military progress at that time that the Americans got the French and the Germans to come in there to stop the Russians and to create this Minsk Accord where they said that we'll work out a strategic autonomy for this region, and over a period of time, Ukrainian government, parliament will pass laws, etc., etc., etc. Now, the UN Security Council approved that Minsk Accord. So today, when Angela Merkel and Hollande, along with Petro Poroshenko, the then Ukrainian Prime Minister, and they say that that was just a holding operation, well, you don't know what to say. You don't know lying, duplicity, all kinds of things. But anyway, we'll leave that aside. But today, if you talk about a ceasefire, all sides will believe that they have lost. Because Russia does not want a ceasefire when it has actually gone this far inside. It wants guarantees. And when Putin won his election just the other day, he talked about a sanitary cordon that he wants. See, essentially, that is what he's been saying ad nauseum for the last 20 years, that he wants some kind of a barrier between some kind of a sanitary cordon, if you like, buffer, that's right. Buffer is the word I'm looking for, between NATO and Russia. And Ukraine threatened to break down that buffer. And that buffer is what Ukraine is refusing to be. So the West, after all the amount of political and actual financial capital that they've invested here, if you say a ceasefire, they will say that they have lost. And they can't afford to do it. That's what I meant right in the beginning. It's an inflexible position. Both have taken. And right now, there is no obvious way out. And therefore, they might find methods other than war to, already Ukraine is trying to do something like attacking Russian installations. There may be all kinds of other political maneuverings besides war. But you need something out of the box today to find any solution.
Sure. If I could turn to you, Mr. Raghavan talked about, somewhat divergent positions being taken by key Western European countries. We've seen that, Germany has sort of, promised to increase its defense spending to unprecedented levels, that too under an SPD government, which I think itself is, I know you've served in Germany as well, so you should come in to talk about this. But we saw President Macron kind of, grandstanding about saying that if necessary, troops have to go. The Polish Prime Minister has seconded that as saying we cannot write things off and so on. And we also know that there is a long-standing sort of debate within Europe, going back to the early Cold War period, about whether there should be a European security force, whether we should have an autonomous sort of a thing. Do you think this conflict is giving more impetus to that, especially in light of concerns that someone like Donald Trump might return to the helm of affairs in the United States, and all the sort of bad memories of what happened in the previous 5 years? Do you think in the current context could mean that we could actually see Europeans getting their act together?
Yes, thank you. Yes, most definitely. Because already the Europeans have realized that they have put in 94 billion in terms of weapons and all kinds of other assistance as well, literally helping to run the state, the Ukrainian state. The Europeans have realized that if there is, this an escalation, because first they had said they would just give a certain type of ammunition. Then we've reached a point of F-16s and tanks. So, and every time the weaponry is becoming more and more sophisticated. So the escalation is dangerous at a time when the economies are feeling the weight of this burden of the war in Ukraine. We call it conflict. And also Europeans are uneasy, nervous that when the new president comes in, President Biden has a low rating of about 39%, so we can expect that it'll be President Trump. And as far as one can predict, a very unpredictable president from his last term, he has, one of the things that he said is that I will stop the war in one day. Now, how he plans to do that remains to be seen, but he is known to be transactional with his friends and his allies and his adversaries as well. So if we have a situation where the Europeans are, the people are beginning, first of all, the European leaders' ratings are going down, the people are getting restive, they're beginning to ask questions, academics are beginning to write papers on what exactly was the sequence of events that led to the Russian operation on February 24th. More and more writers are, and European writers are, dissenting with the popular narrative. And so there will obviously be a reason for, with the new president saying, I'm going to kind of retrench from that Eurasian geopolitics, or if he's going to insist that he will take away NATO troops and installations from and platforms from countries that do not pay up enough, 2% of their GDP. All this is making European leaders, then they had in 2017, they introduced the Common Security and Defense Program, PESCO, and that was to have a number of projects where they would produce their own defense, they rev up their defense industry, and then try to make sure that they have interoperability, that they can talk to each other while fighting, in the sense that their languages, their systems, their weapon systems, their platforms. So all that started in 2017. Now there'll be a sense of urgency with a kind of a withdrawal, if it happens, of resources of US participation, which has also been threatened, that President Trump says, okay, even if I cannot withdraw without the approval of Congress, from NATO, but he can just stop sending people. I understand that he can just stop sending his people to the meetings, and that would have a similar effect of. So the short point to answer your question is that the European Union is getting ready, but so are China and Russia. They are realizing that with the withdrawal of a strong US umbrella from Eurasia, this is a wonderful opportunity for them to, reorient the balance of power in the longer run, but straight away start bringing in their influence and their try to bring in a regime in that area. So let's see where exactly it actually goes. But right now there is an unease in the European Union.
Thanks. Yeah, I wanted exactly to pivot to this point, which is Russia eastwards and the relationship with China. So, Vijay Gokhale, there is a lot of talk that Russia has become a very subordinate player to the People's Republic in the wake of the Ukraine war, that because of the sanctions, isolation, etc., that it has had to face, it is now a junior partner and so on. Now, I'm sure that Russia has its own sense as a great power and its own equities, but in real terms, where is the state of play with that relationship? And more importantly, what does that mean for India? Because that particular triangle, I think, is a very crucial one for us to be able to negotiate. What is your sense of how we are doing it?
On paper, on paper it looks as if they are the junior partner. But, sitting in Beijing, I don't think President Xi Jinping can get a more favorable government in Moscow. If Putin were to fall, or if the West were to somehow manage to dislodge him, any government that succeeds Putin would be less favorable to the Chinese. To that extent, I think China is also dependent on Putin as much as Putin is dependent on China. So it's not that unequal. Secondly, there are alliances and alliances. You have the Anglo-American alliance, which is the full-service alliance, culturally, historically, linguistically, economically, politically aligned. But if you look at Russia and China, the only alignment is an anti-US alignment. They don't share a common history, language, culture, or an economy. Basically, they're standing back to back, defending each other's backs against American quote-unquote imperialism. So I think we should not assume that the Sino-Russian alliance is sort of cast in stone or cement. The last point I want to make is we don't focus on the differences. There are differences that China and Russia have over the Arctic. There is a sense in Russia that they're being exploited by the Chinese. Their oil and gas and minerals are being exploited by the Chinese, who are taking advantage of Russia facing sanctions. And I think there's also some concern that the Chinese have an eye eventually on taking parts of the Russian Far East. So the point is, I think this is an alliance of necessity, but I don't think it is an alliance cast in stone. And this is important for us because we have a relationship with Russia which is not limited to any particular prime minister, any particular government. It is an enduring relationship over 70 years. We've invested a lot, they've invested a lot, and it's important for us to keep that relationship going. So how the Sino-Russian relationship is perceived in India is important for India's policymaker.
And what do you think is Russia's position as far as Sino-Indian relations are concerned?
I think President Putin has, if you look at the statements in the last 1 year, I think he has very clearly signaled that he sees India as a strategic partner, that he doesn't want India to think that he's tilted towards China, and that he's willing to accommodate Indian interests. Now, if we are only going to judge President Putin by saying that you didn't make a particular statement on an issue of my concern and therefore you are siding with the Chinese, then there's nothing more left to be said. But I think diplomacy is not about, is never clear-cut. It's always grey, no? It's not black and white.
Yeah, well, in 1962, Khrushchev famously said that, Indians are our friends and the Chinese are brothers. So, grey and lack of clarity is, I suppose, works both ways. So, sir, you want to come in, please?
Yeah,
Yes.
I want to make a comment on this. People forget even recent history. In June 2021, after Biden met Putin, and let's remember it was Biden who invited Putin. It was Biden who said that Putin is a patriot who has his national interests at heart and he's looking for his country to regain a great power status. Forget about what all he's saying today about Putin. Forget that. His assessment of conversation with Putin, the primary assessment, was that Putin feels that he is being sort of tied to China, and he wants to escape that. And that is why he wants to build relations with America to give him freedom of action vis-a-vis China. I mean, this is what the American president publicly said as, in fact, justification for having invited Putin to Geneva to make that. So, these are perceptions that are elsewhere as well. And American policy until this Ukraine war took place, and there is a reason for, many reasons why that happened, was in fact to see how they can increase the gap between Russia and China. So there is that possibility that people envisage for the reasons that Vijay said.
Sure. Mr. Trimurthy, if I can sort of turn to you, basically to sort of shift the focus of the conversation away from East Asia, Asia-Pacific, Eurasia to West Asia, which is another domain where we are seeing very significant conflict playing out. But in a sense, it's also surprising because it seemed as if the United States was very determined to get out of West Asia and precisely to sort of avoid further involvement in regional conflicts. It seemed like there was a moment when there was a realignment happening within the region itself, some of it happening because of American drive, but some coming from within the region, from countries like Saudi Arabia, UAE, etc. India was also an important player in helping those kind of realignments take shape. And of course, the Chinese also facilitated a certain rapprochement between Iran and Saudi Arabia, which perhaps was the reason why the Americans felt even more impelled to come back into the region. So I'm just wondering, perhaps, if you could begin by giving us, again, a little bit of your appreciation of where you think the conflict between Israel and in Gaza is concerned, where that stands. But then maybe take us a little through what the implications are for that emerging constellation. What is going to happen to all of that? Because I think India invested a lot of its diplomatic energies in West Asia with some very considerable returns. I think it's one of the places where we can really say that there was a very significant shift of moving of the needle. So I'm just wondering what it means for India. Does it mean we are back to the drawing board, or do we still have pieces in place that we can play?
Let me just start with the conflict, or as they call the Gaza war. Now, just to start with what is happening in Gaza, see, while we have condemned the attack of Hamas on Israel. We condemned the fact that they have taken hostages and gone into Gaza, Israeli hostages. But what is happening now is a human tragedy. And I don't think there is any two ways of describing this. It's a huge human tragedy unfolding right before our eyes. And the other thing is that this is a war without a political end. It has a military end defined by Israel, which is the eradication of Hamas and the Hamas infrastructure. What also seems to be quite evident now is that Israel has bought into, the United States has bought into Israel's goal. And they truly believe in the goal of military goal which they have set for themselves. Because, much as they may say outside that they are, trying to see how to avoid casualties and things, but they have not done anything to stop Israel. On the contrary, they have given them the space and the time to go after the Hamas, what they call as Hamas. But of course, we have 14,000 children who have been killed, and they are not Hamas. So anyway, we have to take all this with a pinch of salt. So, but the biggest giveaway was when they could not even request Israel to open for a corridor to give humanitarian aid. And they actually had to airdrop 38,000 meals for a starving population of 1.4 million. So, I mean, this is the type of scale we are talking about. And the irony is that the whole world, whether it is the West or even the Arabs and almost everyone except a very small handful, they want Hamas to be defeated. And that is the irony. I think they don't really want Hamas to be there and doing what they are doing. And the ICJ, for example, I think it's important in the context of the fact that for the first time, they have given a legal foundation for the violations going on. Otherwise, it was basically a set of allegations. Now, if you see this, what is happening in Gaza, and also see what is happening in the West Bank, which people are not focusing on, 500 Palestinians have been killed in the West Bank last year, one of the highest. It is still going on. Houses are being destroyed. People are being evicted. And you juxtapose this of what Prime Minister Netanyahu said just last month, that he is looking at controlling from Jordan to the sea. And this is exactly what they were saying, Hamas was saying, and they're pillorying Hamas. And he has said it. He is a Prime Minister of Israel. So if you look at it, so it is not a war against Hamas. It is a war against the notion of a Palestinian state. That is what this is. And we have to accept it that it is not just an anti-Hamas type of campaign. And if you look at it in that context, that it is a war against the notion of a Palestinian state, then the whole complexion changes. And this is where the other part of the question comes, that how are we looking at West Asia vis-a-vis what is happening there? Now, West Asia, as we all know, was moving towards a certain normalization of relations with Israel. We had the Accords, the Abraham Accords, and it was driven mainly by UAE and Saudi Arabia, and of course the others came in Bahrain and Sudan. But so the Abraham Accords, when they actually took place, there was this, I think it came from the fact that these countries want to get out of the old construct which they had. And they wanted to, internally they were also opening up. Saudi is opening up, the UAE is opening up. And also they wanted to get out of the image of jihadi terrorism and whatever you call it, radicalization, extremism. So they wanted to get out of that and in a way bring up regional stability. I wouldn't use the word realignment because that has a slightly adversarial connotation. More of regional integration and with Israel. And that's where they went. Saudi was very close to it. So I think, and they were also getting out of another important thing, which is that they had their own divisions. They fought for the last 4 years against each other. Qatar and the Gulf countries, and you had, Iran and, Saudis in Yemen, and a whole lot of in Turkey, So now they were also, now they are coming together. That problem is over. And as you say, the rapprochement between Iran and this thing has taken place with brokered by China, or at least catalyst is China. And the Turkey has also been going around making peace. So I think we have now, they wanted to get out of that construct. But the big mistake, which I think they obviously did in hindsight, I can say that, is that they ignored certain historical unfinished business. And one is, of course, this. But let us not forget the occupied Golan. You have occupied Palestine, you have occupied Golan. You also have occupation in Syria, where you have territory of Syria being occupied foreign troops. So occupation is a big word, which covers a whole lot of other things. So this unfinished business was not, came to suddenly start impacting. So looking ahead, my feeling is that this move towards normalization will go on. But it has been stalled. It has not been stopped. It has been stalled. But it will go on. It has to go on because they want a different image of themselves. They want a different geopolitical construct for themselves. So it will go on. But when will it start? That's a very difficult question to say, because it really depends on after the day after. What do you do the day after? How are you going to? Of course, it will be a permanent ceasefire. You will probably have reconstruction, all that, some security arrangement. But will occupation continue? Are you going to look at the day after as continued occupation? Or are you going to look at the day after as the first step towards the goal of a Palestinian state? If you're not going to define the goal, see, one of the problems with Oslo was you didn't define it. So if you cannot define that goal now, you will go back and you'll have the same issue again.
Right. And Saudi Arabia seems to be actually saying that quite clearly, right? That we at least need a credible plan towards a Palestinian state. But if you think some such thing is on the table, then countries in the region like Saudis and other Arab states will actually get involved in Gaza to sort of help?
Actually, that's the crux of the whole matter. See, Saudi Arabia said 2-3 things, and I'm not sure which one is the more authentic one. See, everyone has a plan. And his planning has been there since the Arab initiative, Saudi initiative, a whole lot of initiatives. There are plans and plans. Now, the point is, the day after, how much... see, look at the Arab world. The Arab world wanted normalization. That has been stopped. They had their division. They have mending fences. That is also, they are not sure where it goes. Then you also have a situation where they don't want Hamas to come up. Why? Because they also have extremely wary of Iran, and which is a major player in the whole region. So they are looking at it. Now they want the war to stop because it is affecting their own countries. They have public opinion which is also favoring them. They've controlled it so far, but they can't go on forever. So the point is, how much are they willing to invest? Right now they are only making noise but no action. Let us be frank. I'm talking about the Arab world. So now how much are they going to invest in this to see it through? And are you going to define the goal first or only going to define the process first? So I think I'm not quite convinced that the Arab world is yet there where they're going to see it through. So when will they take the foot off the pedal? I mean, that's what the question is.
Sure. And what does this mean for India? Because we had also taken not just bilateral improvement of relations with Gulf countries, Saudi Arabia, but also other things like I2, U2, etc. I'm just wondering, because we are also part of that same, in a sense, we are an extension of that same process. And we were trying to embed ourselves in a more stable West Asia, as you're saying. But with all this instability, what does that mean then?
See, the thing is that India's reaction to this whole thing has been very measured. And in my opinion, so far, we have got many things right. We quite rightly condemned terror without qualifying it. And later, we also stated our traditional position. And subsequently, we also have expressed deep concern at the civilian casualties. And I think these are all fine. And but at the same time, we have been trying to get into this integration process, which has been stalled at this point of time. And this normalization, see, we don't have to worry about normalization. We normalized in 1992. So that's for them. But we have the best of relations with the Arab world. And whether they are Arabs in Africa or whether you're talking about the Gulf or West Asia, we're the best of relations. So I don't think we have to worry. But I think right now, we need to... And another thing, we don't have to take a proactive stand, let me be frank. When the major players are not taking a proactive stand, Why should we start sticking our neck out? I'm being very frank.
Well, South Africa is doing it, right? I mean, why can't India
South
do it?
Africa has other compulsions. Yeah, there's a very important compulsion there. I don't think we need to do that. So it is something where we are taking, I think, taking it step by step, and I think that's the right thing to do, to be frank.
Mr. Raghavan, one of the things which I think has emerged, not only as a consequence of, but certainly as one of the sort of fallouts of both the conflict in Russia and Ukraine and what is happening in Israel and Gaza, is the emergence of global south once again as a particular kind of an entity or a constellation within the context of global politics. Now, I'm just interested in understanding how much importance do you think such a construct has? Because it has emerged after a fairly long time. There was a period in the 1970s when, under the new international economic order, NAM, etc., in the heyday of those things, that kind of a cartographic or geopolitical division of the world into global north and south did have play. But now it has come back. And it seems to me that there are other things beyond immediate conflicts like climate change, etc., which are also drivers of thinking about a division of interests along those lines. So I'm just wondering, what do you think is the merit of those kinds of constructs? And India is clearly trying to do something with that, right? I mean, at least claim some leadership role in the global south, so to speak. So,
Yeah, well, we had a virtual summit of the Global South. But I would be careful about talking about the Global South as some kind of a structure, some kind of an organization. I think what you have established, for example, in the summit of the Global South that took place before the G20, is that there are views which are non-West in nature. And essentially, you see, it arose out of this Russia-Ukraine situation where a number of countries did not want to buy into this narrative of democracy versus authoritarianism as the template in which this war represented. And they had, many of them, and as they said in the G20, in that Global South Summit before the G20, we are suffering for you guys not being able to settle your security architecture in Europe. So what was being expressed was actually the views of a number of countries, non-Western countries, developing countries, that our interests are being sacrificed on climate change, on food security, fertilizer security, financial security, etc., etc., etc. But having said that, I think it is important to recognize that they don't all have the same interest in all subjects. So you're really talking about trying to put together groupings which have common interests, which are not necessarily all the same groupings. So to think about the Global South as another non-aligned movement or as a substitute of the non-aligned movement would be a mistake. But what it does establish, and what it did establish with great force to the Western countries, the fact that you had a summit like this, it established to them that, look, the world is a more diverse world today than it was during the Cold War. We come back to the same issue. There are many, many countries which feel that they have their own interests and they can push for their interests. They have economic clout, they have military clout, they have regional influence, and they all believe that these are not being recognized. And if you look at, we were talking before this discussion with a few people about BRICS, for example. Why is it that there was this virtual stampede to join BRICS by countries which are disparate and countries which you cannot claim have actually the same ideas as the BRICS countries, some of them allies of the US? What are they trying to say? They're trying to say that, look, we have our own independent outlook and we want this to be recognized. So it was more a signal. And I think Global South has already served a purpose by telling the West that there are concerns that we are not willing to view the entire world through your prism. You need to learn to look at the world through our prism. I think that's the basic.
Sure. Mr. Tirumurthy, you had a ringside view of this in the United Nations itself, the developments that we're talking about. And I'm just wondering what all of this portends for the set of institutions which came into existence after the Second World War. I'm not sure it's quite right to call that the rules-based international order, because that was slightly different. The rules-based is some other newer kind of a story which is being told now. But there has been a lot of talk about the inability of the UN to respond to current challenges, whether it is in terms of development, climate change, environmental issues, security conflicts now. But at the same time, the institution has also been extremely resistant to any significant change. And the UN is only one of the many international organizations which faces similar kinds of problems. So I'm just wondering, do you think the current kind of set of challenges that we face is once again underscoring the need for reform? If so, where is the impetus going to come from? Because if the established powers do not feel that there is anything wrong, and they are happy to let these institutions either survive or wither away, then what stake does the rest of the world have in upholding that system?
So I'll put it this way that, see, there is no question that, UN has suffered, the credibility of UN has suffered considerably in the last 10 years. There's no doubt about it. And you really look at conflicts, then there is complete paralysis in the Security Council between the P5. And the irony is that, when you look at the agenda of the Security Council, in my memory, there's only one country which has got out of the agenda successfully, and that is Colombia. Everything is still there. And you are adding more and more. It's not decreasing. And then you also have, every conflict now is a proxy war. It is not about conflicts between two countries. It is conflict between 15 countries and 5 countries on this side. So you're having a Security Council which is completely polarized. And therefore, this is a sure recipe for, paralysis of, and that's why they are really suffering. But I would not necessarily say that United Nations is not doing enough on the other areas. There are a lot of areas that they have contributed. And if you look at the Israel-Gaza, or I would say Israel-Palestine issue, it's a bit of an irony that some of the most important principles which has been laid down on the passage, over 75 years for Palestine, is from the United Nations. The Security Council had this resolution 242 and then 338. And even, for example, when we talk about Israeli settlements as illegal, who defined illegality? It is United Nations in 2016, and the US let it go through the Security Council. So a lot of markers they have done. But I think right now it suffers a huge crisis, and that's because they are holding hostage to the whole thing. And they also are trying to bring in more on the agenda. For example, it was Russia and India which voted against a resolution in December 2021 to bring in climate change into Security Council. And we, thanks to Russia's veto, actually it was vetoed. But we are only the 2 countries, and China abstained. So I think somewhere down the line, we are having a situation that they are pulling in different directions. And that is why you're not able to have a very coherent type of United Nations. Now, definitely there has to be reform. There is no question about this. Now, how and why that is being debated ad nauseum for about a couple of decades. I would put it this way, because many people ask me this question, so I may as well say it now, that whenever it is reformed, India will be there. I have absolutely no doubt. I think we are big enough to get in there. But it could happen tomorrow, or it could happen a decade later. So that is very, very difficult to predict the trajectory of how the reform goes. But broadly speaking, UN has now become more like a humanitarian aid organization rather than an organization which deals with hard issues and comes up with solutions.
Right. No, and I think at least we must give them some credit for calling a spade in the context of Gaza. I think their statements have been much more forthright.
See, the Secretary General and others have been very, very clear. And they have spoken out against the whole thing, what is happening there. But it's also that's why you're right, partly because we have to distinguish between the countries and the secretariat, and they are, of course, very, very this thing. The countries, for example, when the ICJ gave the ruling, within 24 hours, they pulled out funding from what is called UNRWA, United Nations Relief and Work Agencies. The West pulled out funding. And it is not about, and there was 12 allegations which Israel had made, was without any substantial thing. And finally, now they are all giving back funding because they couldn't prove it. But why did they do that? They didn't do that to deprive the money for the refugees. They did it because one of the 5 or 4 or 5, 6, whatever, final status issues when the Palestinian state is discussed is refugees. So the moment you take out the UN organization out of refugees, you also take out the issue from the final status negotiation. It has a political connotation. So that is why I'm saying that, it's sometimes unfair to blame the UN as a body, but, this is happening. Sorry.
No, I was just thinking of the question that was being asked, that how come the US, which is the biggest supporter of Israel and which gives Israel the courage to do, what it's doing, how come the US could not ask Israel to just open a road and have the aid coming in faster? I mean, now they have to build an alternative way of getting in aid, which is going to take 60 days while people are dying right now. So I absolutely feel that, where is the UNSC? Where is the UNJ? Where is the global governance? I mean, nobody seems to be answerable. I feel quite passionately about that. So that's why I came in, sorry.
No, just to... hers is a comment. Isn't it? not a question, because she knows enough about this too.
Yes, it's just a comment.
But just to come back to UN, the silver lining is what Mr. Raghavan has mentioned. That the silver lining is that the global south, if you see, interestingly, when this Ukraine thing came up, for the very first resolution in Security Council, India was in the Security Council at that time, and I remember going and talking to people. All the 3 Asian countries abstained. China, India, and the United Arab Emirates. All of them abstained. So actually the Ukraine conflict helped the global south, as he very correctly put it, to say that we don't have to take sides. And another thing we should understand is, for 100 countries at least, who are small countries, United Nations is the only voice they have on the global stage. It's very important for them. And that is why, but the bigger developing countries actually abstained. So I think there is the same thing will also operate now in the context of the reform of the UN, which will happen.
Sorry, I may not get a chance to say this later, but I just want to say that this is also the reason for a number of plurilateral, little regional, sub-regional, alliances or partnerships to get things done. And one can name them all, but the point is that this is the only recourse in such a situation where you have global governance, a very thin superficial layer, and below that lots of new things churning and coalescing, and then you can have multiple memberships of one country being in several intersecting alliances. So we all trying to find a way out, find a solution, and that's going to make it more complex and complicated and less effective, I feel.
Can I take one more minute, if you don't mind? See, United Nations, actually, I just take on from this plurilateral is fine. G20 they think is a much more representative thing, what's happened. But the point is, it is only the United Nations which lays down international law. It's only that which brings about a certain element. And if there are violations, the standard is the international law which UN has put together. So therefore, at some point of time, the plurilateral groups are fine, but they will then split the world. The world is as it is split when there is a global disorder, and it's going to get worse. So you need somebody to come together. And if you have UNCLOS, now if you say in South China Sea, China is violating UNCLOS, that's because there is an UNCLOS which has been done and negotiated by all countries in the world. So there are, as I said, I don't want to get into the other areas of the UN, which is working well.
Sure, and I think that's also partly the reason why the United States does not talk about, a system of laws, right? They would rather talk about a system of rules that they have bought in and which works for them. You can not be a signatory to UNCLOS but still insist that, you'd want to do various kinds of things. Exactly, that's what I'm saying. So this is the rules-based international order is defined by the United States in some ways. Mr. Raghavan, finally I want to turn to you and to Vijay Gokhale as well. If we move away from the world of institutions and go back to the question of distribution of power in the international system and so on, right? There is a constant refrain in Indian foreign policy and the way that we articulate it that we would definitely want to see the emergence of a much more multipolar kind of a world order coming in. Currently, perhaps there is United States and China, Russia, as certainly on the military front, if not necessarily on the economic front, technological front, and so on. But, is that kind of a world order really something that you believe will serve India's interests best at a time when there is so much deinstitutionalization, as we've heard, of the international system as a whole?
See, the reality is the world today is multipolar. When you talk about multipolarity, what are you talking about? You're talking about various... I'm not talking about the traditional Western definition of multipolarity, where they say that therefore you need to have two strong powers, otherwise there is no multipolar. I'm not talking about that. You have, after the Cold War in particular, because of the opening up of the world, because of the globalization, technology transfers, the ability of countries to leapfrog stages of development and acquire some kind of a clout. You do have a very large number of medium powers you can talk about, who all believe that they have a right to contribute to the rules-based order. They're willing to take a rules-based order, provided they have some contribution to it. So this is one definition of multipolarity that you have to accept. And India is very much one of those. India will consider itself at the upper end of this multipolar range, rightly so, because of a number of reasons. So this is what you're looking at. Now, what you want is a formalization of this in a structure, and that is why I have slight difference with what Thiru said. I don't think the United Nations in its present form is actually capable of creating that. You need to really think out of the box. Because what do you do? Suppose you have a United Nations Security Council of 30 members. Let us say 10 of them are permanent members. Will they be able to govern the world? I mean, even with this situation, there is not a single UN Security Council resolution that Israel has abided by. It has got away with it. Now, there are many others also. So, I think we are really now struggling to find a structure in which the existing multipolarity can be accommodated, can be defined, and some kind of a modus vivendi between these various groupings, countries, can exist. And I come back to a statement which I made before. As long as you're going to have a zero-sum game approach to international relations, you're not going to get anywhere. If I say I have to destroy Russia in order to retain my position, or I have to destroy China, and vice versa, how are you going to get any kind of a structure? And even during the Cold War, you didn't have that situation. You had some kind of a tense equilibrium. You need to look for that. So it's not a very happy prognosis.
Sure. Mr. Gokhale, turn to you for the last word. I mean, I'm thinking about the crosswinds that are currently blowing. And, as Mr. Raghavan said, a situation where China feels that it's not just emergence as a great power, which in some ways has already happened, but its developmental prospects, etc., are being constrained by the kind of regime that the United States wants to bring about, then that is going to be quite problematic, not just for China, but for all of Asia. And I'm just wondering, what do you think is the best positioning for India, given our own bilateral problems that we have with China? But nevertheless, in terms of navigating this new crosswinds that we are now going to be sort of facing going forward, what do you think is the best approach that we can adopt to ensure that, we are able to sort of avoid conflict of the kind that can be ruinous to all concerned, particularly to us, but at the same time hold our own equities vis-a-vis China in any bilateral or multilateral context as well?
Well, I think the External Affairs Minister's word is multi-alignment, and I think that is the way we have to go forward. But we have emerging emerging issues with all three major countries which we have to sort out, right? With China, we are at the moment in an unstable equilibrium. We haven't solved any of the problems. The old framework is broken after Galwan. There is no new framework. At the moment, we are deterring them, but we are not talking to them. And I think we have to resume that process sooner rather than later, so that you talk and deter to allow a new equilibrium to emerge. If not, the chances of a mishap are quite great. With the US, there's a convergence of interests, and we've seen it very clearly in the last 5 or 10 years. I don't think any of us on this podium would have imagined the relationship with the United States today 10 years ago. But we are going to come up against another problem, and that is not of interest but of values. The United States wants us to be like them. We cannot be like them. Values were not brought by the Europeans to us. We were a civilization long before they existed, and we have our own values. If the US doesn't accommodate our values, then there will be a problem with the interests as well, because we are not going to become another Western country. And I think that's also something that our leadership has spoken of fairly recently, right? With Russia, the thing is, we seem to be letting go of an extremely important strategic relationship, which we should not forget has stood by us through thick and through thin. And it doesn't matter who is ruling Russia. It was the communists, then the Democrats, now the Putin, irrespective of that, they stood with us. We have to repair that relationship and I think trust them that they are not going to sell the store to the Chinese and thereby shortchange us. Now, will they do it or not? I don't know, but I don't think, my gut sense tells me that Russia is as interested in having more friends as we are in having more friends. But that relationship is seriously frayed. And if we don't get that relationship in order, then multi-alignment is not going to happen. So I think multi-alignment is the right direction, but I think in the coming 5 years, I think on all three relationships, the government has a challenge and it has to deal with it.
So the new government has its work cut out for it. Okay, I think we should open up for questions from the floor. Yes, please.
All right, thank you. I think, Gokhale sir, your last comment was like just what one could have just heard your last comment in the whole discussion. I feel that, before I make a comment, my question is that what interest are we talking about from an Indian perspective? Because I did not hear much of the Indian interest that we are trying to protect, and we spoke about all the altercations and the conflict in the world. That's point number one. Point number two is that I think it's a case of opportunity, or rather lost opportunity, that India is seeking. I know some of you said that we should not stick our neck out. Let's be quiet and let the world go around. But I feel this is an opportunity for India to play a role, stick the neck out, and provide some sort of a resolution, primarily because we look at UN Security Council, permanent seat and all of that. But if we don't pitch in, I think it's an opportunity loss. And if there is one country that can take lead, I think it's India. And coming back to United Nations, I think, sir, you rightly said, not only 10 years, but if you go past, it hasn't done enough. And we don't have to look at isolated conflicts like the two that we mentioned. We just have to go back a few years, talk about COVID, and the way WHO took the citizens across the world for a ride is for anybody else to see. My question to you is that how can India latch on to this opportunity that is going geopolitically and make its presence felt for its citizen and the culture that we try to, are known for? Thank you.
Mr. Raghavan is going to answer this question.
No, I would firstly take you up on this point. No, 2 points that you made. Basically, what are India's interests, right? Number one. Number two, why aren't we playing a more proactive role in resolving conflicts in the world, right? Now, actually, I think, without being a member of the BJP and without trying to promote the BJP, let me say that this government has done a hell of a lot to promote India's interests in the world. Sticking its neck out, you take, for example, the Russia-Ukraine war. The amount of pressure that was on us to declare that Russia had invaded Ukraine and violated international law, saying that you're on the wrong side of history, you have to recognize aggression when you see it. Now, there are a few reasons why India reacted the way it did, and all those reasons had to do with India's interests. What do we want to do? You see, we must not lose sight of our fundamental national goals. What are our fundamental national goals? We want development, we want equitable growth, and we want a situation in the country and around the country that promote, that facilitate that. You do not want to create trouble outside the country. You do not want to cut off your nose to spite your face. So, that is only one example. I think Dr. Raghavan mentioned about what we have done in West Asia. Look at what we have done to create relationships in West Asia to make sure that they do not act against our interests, to make sure that terrorist havens in those countries are not allowed to act against us. Look at the way in which we have developed relations with West Asian countries without damaging our relations with Israel, in fact, promoting our relations with Israel. You know, and at the same time, we talked about the Global South. Look at the way in which we were able to mobilize the Global South in order to articulate their views, to be able to show to the West that there are views other than yours. All of these are in India's interest. And when we said that we will buy oil from Russia, we said we don't want to damage our economy. We want to promote our economy. So you talk about financial security, fuel security, fertilizer security, food security. We made sure that we had all of that through this mess in the world. Okay, then when you come to, so there are, in every possible way, we have been focused on what we want. We want development, growth for our population. Without that, you're not going to become a developed country. Without that, you're not going to take your stage in the world. That's what we've been doing. The other question that you said about resolving conflicts. I think you should read this particular book of Vijay Gokhale. You see, you cannot jump into mediation without understanding that the ground is available for it. You have to understand what are the major motivations driving the parties to a conflict. Are you able to fulfill their motivations? If those motivations are fundamentally irreconcilable, by going in there, you are only creating more problems. You will ruin your reputation as an honest broker because each side will feel that you are playing. I mean, that's what happened during this whole, in this series of incidents that Mr. Gokhale has mentioned in this book. So one has to be careful. One may have a great global reputation, but one cannot play that reputation without realizing that there are ground realities that are conducive to that. So that's my answer to your two questions.
And also,
Yeah, LinkedIn come. Right there, the lady there, yeah.
Good evening, everyone. My question is, I think it's a bit far-fetched, but how do you think the recent Sweden membership to NATO could have any further implications on India?
thank you. Actually, they have joined the European, the NATO at a time when the NATO is quite concerned about how it's going to really function. The new president of the US is going to completely seriously reevaluate the purpose and the mission of NATO itself. So they've joined at a time which will, of course, initially it will create a new kind of balance of the power between both and a kind of a new regional architecture. But they are not going to be joining they're not going to be very much reassured about their security at this moment when they join. And they have, by joining NATO, actually put themselves in the front line, I feel. But let's see how it plays out.
Yeah, sorry. What we'll do is we'll take both those questions together so that we can save a little bit of time. We are running out against the clock.
Yeah,
so first ask a question, then you can give him the mic.
yeah. So my question is, in this zero-sum game of international politics, do we have any solution without hegemonic bipolarity or fragmenting multipolarity?
Okay.
So that's my question.
And my question is, the government, as maintained since long that we would reclaim what is India's territory in Aksai Chin and the Arunachal Pradesh. China has captured a lot of territories there. So if in the future, if we go, how do we do it? If we go for a war, would Russia and US would support us, and how could we get our territory back?
No. So, China, you want to talk about hegemonic stability
Russia
and so on, and then maybe you can talk about Aksai Chin.
Saying, will Russia and US help us?
No, but this is the question this is the question that the lady asked, yeah? About fragmenting multipolarity and bipolarity. You know, you have today a situation of effective bipolarity in a number of areas between US and China. But you also have multipolarity in terms of various countries being able to exercise their choices and sort of fulfill their interests, to promote their interests. So what you're looking at is the progression from this towards a situation where there is greater accommodation and some kind of a structure of accommodation possible in order to have a non-confrontational, as I think the PM said in one context, that we should have competition. Competition should not degenerate into conflict. So you need to have a structure where competition and a multipolarity and effective bipolarity in some areas can coexist in some kind of an equilibrium, even if that is a tense equilibrium, as it took place during the Cold War. We are nowhere near that. But anyway.
Yeah. I think on the territorial question, it's quite clear both countries have recognized that you can only solve this matter through a give and take in the negotiation. Right? Neither has spoken about getting it by force, and I don't think two nuclear-armed neighbors anymore can acquire or lose territory by force. The question is, how do you build enough trust and understanding between the two countries to allow for the boundary issue to be settled? Now, we were working in that direction until regrettably what happened in Galwan has resulted in a setback. Now, whether this was by design, whether the Galwan incident was by design or by mistake is another matter, because we don't know what the thinking of the Chinese side was. But what they've done is they have sort of created in the Indian public opinion a perception of threat from China. And where Indian public opinion has that perception, it limits the possibilities of any elected government to do anything. After all, these days, foreign policy, like domestic policy, requires public support. You can't just do whatever you want in foreign policy anymore. So it's made it harder because of Chinese missteps or strategic mistakes. Nonetheless, at least I think that there is a mature leadership on both sides, that at some stage a new equilibrium will be set. And of course, while the long-term there is a parliamentary resolution which says that we have to, Aksai Chin is part of India. And until the parliamentary resolution remains, that remains an objective. But we have to also be realistic in understanding that we are not dealing with a small country on the other side. We're dealing with what is effectively the world's number 2 power now, right? So we should not be talking in terms of simply a border problem. We should be talking in terms of how we establish a new equilibrium between two major powers in ways that serve our interest. And of course, one of those interests is settlement of the border.
I think we have time for just one last question.
I'll go ahead. Good evening. This is to Mr. Gokhale. Mr. Gokhale, your last comment about how Russia stuck with us through time, that seemed a little emotional, because I just feel that Russia or USSR stuck with us because of their interests, and they had really nothing to lose per se, and they had their interests going on. Similarly, connecting this with the China bit, I think PM Nehru had very good intentions in recognizing the PRC back then and felt that we could be neighbors. And technically, I believe before Tibet was occupied, we never were neighbors. So that well-intentioned move really didn't help us and led us to 62. But connecting that with the Russia bit, I do believe, yes, Russia and India do have strategic interests, but shouldn't we be more calculated and not really see that Russians stuck with us then and they have to stick with us now? So could you elaborate on that comment?
Sure. And I think we have just one last question. Yes.
Yeah, this is addressed to Mr. Gokhale. You see, when the present government today, particularly the Prime Minister, started off, he really, I think, made a lot of effort to improve Indo-China relations. We had the visit of the Chinese president, and we had all those, we thought that we'll have improved relations with China. But somehow, unfortunately, those border incidents happened, and they have created a very strong public opinion. As we can see from the question, everybody's talking about trying to fight a war with China and get back our territory by force, etc., etc. This kind of talk is going on in the country. On the other side, we see China. Slowly and slowly, they are almost trying to, I had a feeling they strangulate India by having Maldives influence becoming stronger, Sri Lankan influence, Bangladesh, Nepal, Pakistan. Sometimes I have a feeling that China, as a matter of strategy, is trying to surround India with a counterpoint presence from their side. It may be their strategy. And now we also have the Russia, China, and Iran nexus, which apparently works against the Indian interest in that sense. So in such a scenario, how do you think, and it's also accepted almost that China is a much stronger country, a bigger country, and we can't sort of have a fight with them. So we have to negotiate, we have to talk to them. Maybe from a point of strength or point of weakness, I don't understand. But as diplomats, all of you are concerned, how do we deal with China? Because we can't fight a war with China, and neither can China fight a war with us, actually, because both of us are nuclear powered. So what do you think is the way ahead? How will this impasse be broken? That's very important. In the next 5 years, for the next government maybe, will it take an initiative now again with a fresh government starting to have something? Or will the public opinion be too strong? Because right now we have a very strong public opinion. But still, on the other hand, we also have a very strong economic relationship. We have a huge, import-export going on with China. We have a huge economic dependence and interdependence on China, particularly us, we are dependent. So it's a very complex situation with China. I think that is the most important strategic challenge for our country, even probably more important than Russia or USSR or USA.
So I'll be very brief because I think we're running out of time. On the Russia question, I didn't say that our relationship is only with Russia. My simple point was there is no fundamental conflict of interest we have with Russia on any issue. We have to carry Russia with us if multi-alignment is to mean something. Abandoning Russia at this stage is, in my opinion, a mistake. It still has the second largest number of nuclear weapons in the world. The sheer size of its territory and the resources within it are necessary if we are to grow a $10 trillion economy, and it's sitting on the other side of our adversary. So there are very clear reasons why we need the Russians. As far as the Chinese issue is concerned, sir, I just want to make one thing clear. There is no exclusive backyard anybody has anymore. The Monroe Doctrine is gone. The Chinese and Russians are sitting in Venezuela, in Bolivia, and in parts of Central America. The whole problem with Russia, Ukraine is the Russian backyard is gone as well because the NATO is there. And the Chinese backyard don't have a backyard either because the Americans are all over South and Northeast Asia. And the Australians don't have a backyard either because the Chinese are in the South Pacific. So I don't think we should be wringing hands about Maldives going here and Sri Lanka going there. Our issue is there is a shared space. How do we protect our security interests in that shared space? And I think that is the approach the government, and not just this government, I would think from the Vajpayee government onwards. This has been the objective. How do we protect our interests vis-a-vis China and vis-a-vis other great powers in that shared space? And I think in that we have done fairly well. Okay, at the moment there's a problem in the Maldives. A couple of years ago it was there with Nepal. That's part of international relations. But broadly, I think, we can certainly say today we are in a more secure position than we were, say, 20 years ago, where our greater neighborhood is concerned.
Please join me in thanking all our panelists. Could I request all of you to come up front for a group photo with the book? I'd like to thank our audience for joining us this evening. We look forward to hosting all of you again at a future Carnegie event soon. Just a note, Crosswinds and the long game are available for purchase outside in the lobby. Thank you.